Steve Harvey's mother called him on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was different than he'd ever heard it before. She sounded small. She sounded scared. She was calling to tell him that she'd been admitted to the hospital. The tests had come back. It wasn't good news. The doctors suspected cancer. They needed to do more tests, but the preliminary diagnosis was serious. She was trying to stay positive for his sake, but the fear was unmistakable in her voice. Steve had built an empire. He was one of the most successful entertainers in America. He'd come from poverty and made something of himself. He'd won multiple Emmy Awards. He'd hosted Family Feud, Miss Universe, and countless other major television productions. He had wealth and fame and influence that most people could never imagine. But in that moment, listening to his mother's frightened voice, none of it mattered. None of it could fix what was happening in that hospital room. All the money in the world couldn't buy her health. All the success in the world couldn't guarantee her life. Steve's mother, Eloise, had been the absolute foundation of his entire life. She'd kept the family together when his father had been abusive and violent. She'd worked hard, cleaning houses and taking whatever jobs she could find to put food on the table. She'd sacrificed everything for her children. She'd raised Steve to believe in God, to believe in hard work, to believe that faith could sustain you through anything. And now, she was the one who needed sustaining. The relationship between Steve and his mother was profound and deep. Even as an adult, even as a successful man, Steve checked on his mother regularly. He called her every week. He visited her whenever he could. He made sure she had everything she needed. He'd never forgotten where he came from. He'd never forgotten the woman who'd sacrificed everything to raise him right. He'd never forgotten the nights she'd sung to him as a child, songs of faith and hope. He'd never forgotten how she'd protected him from his father's rage. And now that woman was lying in a hospital bed, facing a diagnosis that could take her from him forever. Steve had vivid memories of his childhood. He remembered his mother working double shifts. He remembered her coming home exhausted and still finding energy to help him with his homework. He remembered her taking him to church on Sunday mornings, dressed in her best clothes, even though they barely had money. He remembered her teaching him that God was always there, even when everything else fell apart. She'd been his constant. She'd been his rock. She'd been the person who believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. She'd been the reason he made it out of poverty. She'd been the reason he didn't end up like so many of his childhood friends. Steve got on a plane that night, without hesitation. He canceled his appearances. He canceled his obligations. He canceled the television taping that was scheduled. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered except getting to his mother. He arrived at the hospital in Memphis where his mother was staying. She was in a private room, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed and monitored her vital signs. She looked smaller in the hospital bed than he remembered. Her hair was wrapped in a scarf. Her skin looked pale under the fluorescent hospital lights. But when she saw Steve walk through the door, she smiled. Even in her fear, even in her pain, even in the uncertainty of her future, she smiled. They talked for hours. She told him about the symptoms she'd been having that she'd initially ignored. She told him about the pain that had finally sent her to the doctor. She told him about the doctor's concerns and the need for more testing. She told him that she was scared, but that she was putting her faith in God. She told him that whatever happened, she wanted him to know how proud she was of him. She wanted him to promise her that he would keep his faith strong no matter what came next. She reminded him that success in this world meant nothing if you lost your soul. She reminded him that God was the only real security. Steve promised her. He held her hand. He prayed with her right there in the hospital room, kneeling beside her bed. But as night fell and the hospital quieted down, as the visiting hours ended and he had to return to the waiting room, Steve felt something breaking inside him. His mother was suffering. His mother could be dying. All his success, all his achievements, everything he built seemed meaningless in the face of losing her. He felt helpless in a way he'd never felt before. His money couldn't help. His fame couldn't help. His influence couldn't help. For the first time, he understood that some things couldn't be fixed with anything except faith. That night, Steve couldn't sleep. He sat in the waiting room, staring at the walls, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. He thought about his mother's sacrifice. He thought about everything she'd done for him. He thought about what his life would be like without her. He thought about how much he still needed her. Around 2 a.m, unable to bear the waiting and the uncertainty anymore, something drew him to leave the hospital. He didn't consciously decide to do it. His feet just started moving. He found himself walking through the empty streets of Memphis at 2 a.m. in the darkness. And somehow, almost without realizing it, he found himself at the church his mother had taken him to as a child, the little brick church that had been his spiritual foundation. The doors were unlocked. The sanctuary was empty, but the lights were still on, as if waiting for him. Steve walked inside. The pews stretched out before him, row after row of empty wooden benches worn smooth by decades of worshipers. Above the altar hung a large wooden cross. The church was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. The smell of old hymnals and furniture polish filled the air. Steve walked slowly to the front, and he knelt down at the altar. For the first time in years, in that moment of absolute desperation, he knelt in a church, and he prayed like he meant it. He prayed with the faith of a child. He prayed with the desperation of a son facing the loss of his mother. He prayed for his mother's healing. He prayed with a desperation that came from a place deeper than his celebrity, deeper than his success, deeper than anything he built in his career. He prayed like he had prayed as a child, with complete faith and complete vulnerability. He prayed for God to intervene. He prayed for God to save his mother's life. He prayed for a miracle. He begged God to spare her. He promised God that he would serve him better, that he would use his platform differently, that he would be a better witness to his faith, if only God would save his mother. But then something shifted in his prayer. He thought about all the other people in that hospital right then. He thought about all the other families sitting in waiting rooms at that moment, facing similar fears, facing similar helplessness. He thought about the cancer patients and the heart disease patients and the stroke patients and all the people suffering in hospital beds across America. He thought about all the mothers and fathers and children facing diagnoses that could change everything. He thought about all the suffering happening in that hospital and in hospitals across the country at that very moment. And his prayer expanded beyond his own mother. He began praying not just for his mother, but for all the sick and suffering people. He began praying for their families. He began praying for the doctors and nurses who were trying to save lives. He began praying for wisdom and compassion and healing for everyone in pain. Steve prayed for hours. He lost track of time completely. He cried. He begged God for mercy, not just for his mother, but for everyone who was hurting. As his prayer deepened, he felt something shift inside him. He felt a peace that he couldn't explain. It wasn't the peace of certainty that everything would be fine. It was the peace of surrender. It was the peace of completely letting go and putting everything in God's hands. He felt like he'd released something that had been weighing on him. He felt like he'd handed everything over to God, and whatever happened next was in God's hands. By the time dawn started breaking through the church windows, painting everything in soft gold light, Steve felt different. He felt lighter. He felt like he'd released something that had been weighing on him. He gathered himself and he stood up from where he'd been kneeling. His knees were stiff from being in one position for so long. His face was streaked with tears. But he felt different. He felt ready for whatever came next. When Steve returned to the hospital at dawn, something unexpected was happening. His mother had woken early and had requested to be moved to the hospital's chapel. She wanted to pray. The hospital chaplain had come to see her, and somehow word had spread through the hospital that Steve Harvey was there, that his mother was ill, that he'd been praying through the night. Patients who were able to walk had started making their way to the chapel. Family members who had been staying at the hospital were arriving. Nurses were taking their breaks to sit in the chapel. Hospital staff were coming. It was like word of something spiritual was spreading through the hospital organically, person to person. By the time Steve arrived at the chapel, there were over 100 people gathered in that small hospital chapel and in the hallway outside of it. Some were patients in hospital gowns with IV stands beside them. Some were family members who'd been waiting and worrying. Some were hospital staff who'd heard about what was happening. Some were people from the community who'd heard that Steve Harvey's mother was in the hospital and had come to pray. They were all there together, united in faith, united in hope, united in prayer. His mother was sitting in a chair in the front of the chapel, tears streaming down her face, and when she saw Steve, she took his hand. Steve stood in front of them all. He didn't plan what he was going to say. He didn't have notes or a script. He just opened his mouth and spoke from his heart. He talked about his mother and how she had raised him. He talked about how she'd worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table. He talked about how she'd kept him off the streets. He talked about how she'd taken him to church even when she was exhausted from working all day. He talked about how she'd taught him that faith was the most important thing, more important than success, more important than money, more important than fame. He talked about how in this moment, facing the possibility of losing her, he understood what she'd been trying to teach him his whole life. And then he prayed. He prayed with all those people in that chapel. He prayed for his mother's healing. He prayed for everyone in that hospital. He prayed for the families who were suffering. He prayed for the doctors and nurses who were fighting to save lives. He prayed with a voice that was shaking with emotion, with a sincerity that cut through any sense of his celebrity status. In that moment, he was just a man praying for his mother, praying with other people who were hurting. The celebrity was gone. The success was irrelevant. He was just a son who loved his mother and was asking God to save her life. When he finished praying, the entire chapel was crying. Patients were crying. Family members were crying. Nurses were crying. Steve was crying. His mother was crying. Every person in that room was moved by something beyond themselves. It was like the presence of something holy, something powerful, something that transcended medicine and science. It was like pure faith made manifest. People later described it as one of the most spiritual experiences of their lives. Some said they felt the presence of God in that room. Some said they felt their own faith restored. Over the next days, something miraculous began happening. Steve's mother's tests came back. The initial diagnosis was wrong. It wasn't cancer. It was a serious infection that was treatable with antibiotics. The relief in the hospital was palpable. But more than that, her recovery was faster than the doctors expected. Within a week, her condition began improving dramatically. Within 2 weeks, she was well enough to go home. The doctors called it remarkable. The people who had prayed in that chapel called it a miracle. The spiritual community called it evidence of the power of faith. But the impact of that moment in the chapel extended far beyond his mother's recovery. The story spread through the hospital. It spread through the community. It spread across the internet. People shared the story of Steve Harvey kneeling in an empty church at 2 a.m, praying for his mother and for everyone who was suffering. People shared the story of him gathering people in a hospital chapel and leading them in prayer. People shared the story of his mother's miraculous recovery. The story became about faith. It became about surrender. It became about community. The video of Steve praying in the hospital chapel was recorded by a nurse who felt compelled to document the moment. She wasn't looking to create viral content. She was documenting something sacred. When it was posted online, it went viral anyway. Within days, it had been viewed millions of times. People commented about how it had restored their faith. People commented about how it had made them cry. People commented about how it had inspired them to pray, to believe, to hope, even in dark moments. Churches reported increased attendance in the weeks following the video going viral. Prayer groups formed. People began sharing their own stories of faith and healing. The moment became bigger than Steve Harvey. It became about something universal, the human need to believe in something greater than ourselves. The power of community prayer, the possibility of miracles, the strength of faith in the face of suffering. Steve's mother recovered fully. She returned home and spent the next years helping other cancer patients and their families. She became an advocate for faith-based healing. She spoke at churches and hospitals about the power of prayer. This is the story of what happened when fame and fortune met faith and family. This is the story of a hospital chapel at dawn, filled with sick people and their families, all united in prayer. Steve never forgot that night in the church. He never forgot the feeling of absolute surrender, of handing everything over to God and accepting that he couldn't control the outcome, only his faith in God. He talked about it in interviews for the rest of his life. He talked about how it had changed him fundamentally. He talked about how success meant nothing if you didn't have your faith and your family. He talked about how the hospital chapel moment had been one of the most spiritual and transformative experiences of his life. The story of that night spread far beyond the hospital and the church. Religious leaders began citing it as an example of faith in action. Teachers used it in their classes to discuss what faith meant. Counselors used it to help people who were struggling with their own crises. The moment became a parable for modern times. It showed that in a world obsessed with celebrity and success and material wealth, the most powerful moments came when you surrendered everything to God. Steve's mother became a living testimony to the power of prayer. She recovered not just physically, but spiritually strengthened. She spent her remaining years dedicated to helping others. She visited hospitals. She prayed with the sick. She shared her story with anyone who would listen. She became an unofficial chaplain of her own community. She showed people that faith wasn't just something you believed in on Sunday mornings at church. It was something that sustained you in your darkest moments. Years later, when Steve's mother passed away at an advanced age, surrounded by her family and her faith intact, the community mourned her deeply. She had touched so many lives. She had inspired so many people. The hospital chapel where she had recovered became a place of pilgrimage for people seeking healing and hope. The church where Steve had prayed all night became known as a place of answered prayers. Steve Harvey carried the lessons of that night throughout the rest of his life. He became more open about his faith. He used his platform to talk about God. He used his money to help people in crisis. He never forgot what his mother had taught him, that faith was more valuable than success, that family was more important than fame, that God was the ultimate source of strength. The story of Steve Harvey praying in an empty church at 2 a.m. for his mother and for all suffering people became a story that transcended television and entertainment. It became a story about what it meant to be human. It became a story about love. It became a story about faith in its purest form. It became a story that reminded people that no matter how successful you became, no matter how much money you had, when facing the possibility of losing someone you loved, you would kneel down and pray. You would surrender your ego and your pride and your accomplishments, and you would just be a person, hoping that God would hear you, hoping that God would save the person you loved most. This is the story of what happened when fame and fortune met faith and family. This is the story of a hospital chapel at dawn, filled with sick people and their families, all united in prayer, all believing in the possibility of miracles. It's a reminder that the most powerful moments in our lives are not when we're on top, but when we're on our knees. It's a reminder that faith can save us. It's a reminder that love never stops, no matter how far away success takes us. It's a reminder that the person who raised you matters more than any achievement you'll ever accomplish. The impact of that moment extended into the lives of every single person who was in that hospital chapel that dawn. For some, it changed their faith forever. For some, it restored a faith they'd lost. For some, it showed them that prayer actually worked, that God actually heard, that miracles were possible. Many of the people who were patients in that hospital chapel went on to recover from their illnesses. They attributed their recovery, at least in part, to being part of something so spiritually powerful. The nurses who witnessed Steve's prayer became better nurses. They began treating their patients with more compassion, understanding that the spiritual dimension of healing was as important as the